Rain drummed against the reinforced glass of Vivian's corner office, sounding less like water and more like gravel. Down below, the city was drowning, but up here she only cared about quarterly projections. Then she saw it, that rusted, bruised 1994 pickup truck idling next to her pristine silver Porsche. A single dad with dirt under his nails and a laugh that scraped her nerves. She thought he was a punchline. 30 minutes later, she was choking on muddy river water, and he was the only thing standing between her and the bottom of the ravine. Gravel crunched like crushed bone under the thick rubber tires of Tom Barrett's 1994 Ford F250. The truck shuddered as it idled, a rhythmic, uneven coughing sound that vibrated right up through the cracked vinyl of the bench seat and settled deep in Tom's molars. The cab smelled of stale French fries, wet wool, and the sharp chemical tang of motor oil that never quite washed out of his cuticles. Beside him, strapped into a booster seat that had seen better days, 7-year-old Maya was asleep, her cheek pressed against the window. A thin line of drool pooled on the glass. Tom reached over his joints, popping, and gently tucked her pink fleece blanket tighter around her shoulders. School had let out 3 hours early, a flash flood warning. Not that the site manager for Hayes Logistics cared. Get the soil samples delivered before 3 or don't bother coming back Monday. That was the text. He shifted into park. The transmission engaged with a metallic clank that sounded expensive. Tom winced. Outside, the air was thick, suffocatingly heavy, carrying the metallic scent of ozone and the earthy stench of the dry riverbed waiting for rain. The development site sat in a shallow valley, just outside the city limits, a massive expanse of raw dirt and yellow excavators, waiting to be transformed into a state-of-the-art distribution hub. Tom grabbed his clipboard, pushing the heavy driver's side door open. The hinges screamed. He stepped out into the humid air boots, sinking instantly into a patch of soft red mud. And that was when he saw her. Vivian Hayes did not belong in the dirt. She stood a few yards away, flanked by 2 anxious-looking project managers, holding architectural blueprints that were whipping aggressively in the rising wind. She wore a charcoal pantsuit, tailored so sharply it looked like armor. The fabric was stiff, unyielding. Her posture was razor straight, her expression a mask of hardened impatience. She smelled of cold espresso and expensive, citrus-heavy perfume, a scent that aggressively cut through the smell of the impending storm. Behind her, parked on the only concrete slab poured so far, sat a brand-new Porsche Taycan. It was liquid silver, sleek, low to the ground, aggressively silent. It looked less like a car and more like a weapon. The drainage routing is unacceptable, Vivian was saying, her voice perfectly modulated, yet carrying the cutting edge of a serrated knife. If the retention pond overflows the warehouse floor, floods. It's basic topography, gentlemen. Do I need to teach you how gravity works? Tom approached, keeping his head down. He wasn't here to argue with the billionaire CEO who owned the ground he was walking on. He just needed a signature on the sample log so he could get Maya home before the sky broke open. "Excuse me," Tom rumbled, his voice gravelly from a lack of sleep and too much black coffee. "Got the soil reports for the eastern ridge." Vivian stopped mid-lecture. She turned slowly, her dark eyes dropping from his scuffed, mud-caked steel-toe boots up to his faded flannel shirt, lingering for a fraction of a second on the grease stain near his collar. Her gaze was not disgusted. It was worse. It was entirely dismissive. She took the clipboard with 2 fingers, signing her name in swift, angular strokes without reading the top sheet. She handed it back, her eyes shifting past him to the idling Ford F250. The truck let out a loud, sudden backfire. A puff of black exhaust shot out of the tailpipe hanging in the damp air. Vivian's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. A short, sharp sound escaped her throat. A laugh. But there was no humor in it. "Is that an antique or simply a safety hazard, Mr. Barrett?" she asked, reading his name off the embroidered patch on his jacket. Tom felt a hot flush creep up the back of his neck. He swallowed the defensive retort resting on his tongue. He needed this contract. "It gets the job done, Miss Hayes. Most days." "I'm sure it does," Vivian said, turning her attention back to her project managers. "Though I imagine most days doesn't cover efficiency. Good day, Mr. Barrett." Tom didn't say anything. He turned and walked back to the truck. He climbed in the springs, groaning in protest. Maya stirred her eyes, fluttering open. "Are we going home, Daddy?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes with the back of a small, grubby hand. "Yeah, Bug. We're going home." Tom twisted the key. The starter ground. A harsh, whining scrape of metal on metal. He pumped the gas pedal. "Come on. Not now." The engine sputtered, caught, and then died with a pathetic wheeze. Outside, he could see Vivian Hayes watching him from the corner of her eye. She wasn't smiling, but the condescension radiating from her posture was deafening. She tapped a button on her key fob. The Porsche's headlights flashed a crisp, brilliant white. The flush door handles slid out with a quiet, satisfying whir. It was a machine of absolute perfection. Tom gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the worn, sticky steering wheel. He twisted the key again, holding it, praying to whatever God watched over broke single fathers. The truck shook violently, belched a cloud of smoke, and finally roared to life, settling into its rough idle. Vivian shook her head, sliding into the pristine, leather-scented interior of her Porsche. The door shut with a solid, muffled thud, sealing her in a soundproof cocoon of wealth and engineering. Tom threw the truck into gear and pulled away the tires, spitting mud. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He just watched the sky ahead, where the bruised plum clouds were rolling in, fast, heavy, and pregnant with violent rain. The sky didn't open. It collapsed. 10 minutes after Vivian left the site, the rain hit the windshield of her Taycan, not in drops, but in sheets. The wipers operating on their highest automated setting slapped frantically against the glass, struggling to clear the deluge. The ambient lighting inside the cabin glowed a soft, soothing blue, a stark contrast to the chaotic grey violence outside. Vivian gripped the steering wheel, the Alcantara leather feeling suddenly clammy against her palms. She hated driving in the rain. It was chaotic, unpredictable. She thrived on control on spreadsheets and scheduled margins. Weather was an inefficient variable. The road out of the valley was a 2-lane blacktop that snaked alongside the dried riverbed. Except the riverbed wasn't dry anymore. Through the blur of the rain, Vivian saw the water. It was rising with terrifying speed, churning violently thick with red mud, broken branches, and garbage. It wasn't just filling the trench, it was cresting the banks, spilling over the asphalt in fast, shallow waves. "Recalculating route." The navigation system chimed a pleasant synthetic female voice that grated against Vivian's fraying nerves. "Flash flood warning in effect. Proceed with caution." "Mute," Vivian snapped. She pressed the accelerator. The electric motors delivered instant torque. The Porsche surged forward, cutting through a puddle that was deeper than she anticipated. A heavy spray of dirty water fanned out over the windshield, momentarily blinding her. Just get to the incline. 2 miles ahead, the road sloped sharply upward toward the highway. If she could just reach the incline. But the water was moving too fast. It was no longer crossing the road. It was running down the road, turning the asphalt into a shallow, rushing river. The Taycan was incredibly heavy, due to its battery packs, which gave it a low center of gravity. Under normal circumstances, it meant perfect handling. Right now, it meant the undercarriage was dragging through 3 inches of fast-moving water. A red warning icon flashed on the digital dashboard. Chassis fault. No, 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 Vivian muttered, tapping the glass screen, trying to clear the warning. The car shuddered. Not a mechanical vibration, but a digital hesitation, as if the onboard computers were suddenly confused. The water level rose to 6 inches. It was lapping against the bottoms of the doors. Suddenly the steering wheel jerked in her hands. The rushing water was pushing against the broad side of the low-slung car, fighting the tire traction. Vivian overcorrected her heart, giving a violent, uncharacteristic lurch. A cold knot tightened at the base of her throat, making it hard to swallow past the lingering taste of her morning espresso. Then came the sound. A deep, hollow, rushing noise, easily penetrating the soundproof glass. The river had fully breached its banks 100 yards ahead. A wall of muddy water, perhaps a foot high, was rolling down the blacktop directly toward her. Vivian slammed on the brakes. The anti-lock system pulsed uselessly against the waterlogged pavement. The car slid to a halt, just as the wave hit the front bumper. The impact was shockingly violent. The Porsche groaned, the nose lifting slightly before slamming back down. Instantly, the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. Warning chimes layered over each other in a cacophony of panic. Battery fault, drive system error, water intrusion detected. The digital screens flickered, tearing into lines of static, and then went entirely black. The soft blue ambient lighting died. The quiet hum of the climate control ceased. Silence fell inside the cabin, save for the terrifying roar of the water outside. Vivian pressed the start button. Nothing. She pressed it again harder, her manicured nail digging into the plastic. Start. Start, you overpriced piece of garbage. Nothing. The electric car was dead, its complex circuitry overwhelmed by the brute force of nature. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through her composed exterior. She looked out the window. The water was halfway up the door, churning with violent energy. A thick branch slammed against her passenger side door, making her flinch. She reached for the door handle, pulling it twice to manually override the electronic latch. She shoved her shoulder against the heavy door, intending to get out and walk to higher ground. It didn't budge. The pressure of the rushing water pressing against the outside of the door was immense. She braced her feet against the floorboard, gritting her teeth, and shoved with all her might. The door cracked open an inch. Instantly, freezing, filthy water poured through the gap, soaking her expensive trousers, flooding the pristine footwell. The smell was horrific, rotting leaves, silt and raw sewage. Vivian gasped, the shock of the cold stealing her breath. The water pressure slammed the door shut again, trapping her leg for an agonizing second before she yanked it back. She was trapped. The water inside the cabin began to rise, seeping in through the floor vents. It was at her ankles, cold, merciless. She pulled out her phone. No signal. The storm was disrupting the cell towers. Vivian Hayes, CEO, billionaire board member of 3 Fortune 500 companies, sat in the dark, freezing water, creeping up her shins, and felt utterly, completely helpless. She looked at her reflection in the dark, dead infotainment screen. Her hair was messy, her eyes wide, stripped of all her carefully cultivated authority. Outside, the water level crept higher, reaching the bottom of her windows. The car shifted the tires, lifting a fraction of an inch off the asphalt. It was beginning to float, and if it floated, it would be swept into the ravine. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breathing coming in fast, shallow, ragged gasps. For the first time in her life, she had no strategy. She had no leverage. Then, through the deafening roar of the flood, she heard it, a harsh, rhythmic coughing sound, a grinding V8 engine. Tom was 2 miles up the incline when he saw the headlights in his rearview mirror vanish. He had been crawling up the grade, fighting the wind, pushing against the broad side of the F250. Maya was awake now, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide, as she watched the rain pummel the windshield. When he looked back and saw nothing but the dark, churning water at the bottom of the valley, a heavy stone dropped in his gut. She's fine, his rational mind argued. She's got $100,000 car. She probably just pulled over. But he knew the river. He had grown up fishing in it when it flowed, and he knew how fast it turned lethal when it flooded. The Porsche was practically glued to the asphalt. It had zero clearance. Tom swore under his breath. He looked over at Maya. "Bug, I need you to stay buckled in. We got to go back for a minute." He didn't wait for her to argue. He threw the heavy gear shifter into reverse, backing down the shoulder of the road until he could safely pull a U-turn. He jammed the transfer case lever on the floorboard, hard, yanking it into four-wheel drive low. The front hubs engaged with a heavy, satisfying clunk. The old Ford descended back into the valley. The headlights cut through the torrential rain, illuminating a nightmare. The road was gone. In its place was a raging torrent of brown water. About 50 yards into the flood zone, sitting askew, was the silver Taycan. The water was halfway up its windows. The back end of the car was drifting, swinging slowly toward the steep drop-off of the ravine. Tom slammed the truck into park on the edge of the rushing water. The F250 sat high enough that the water rushing around its massive mud-terrain tires didn't reach the cab, but the current was strong enough to make the 3-ton truck shudder. He threw open the door. The roar of the water was deafening. The wind whipped rain into his face like tiny needles. He reached behind the seat and dragged out a thick, mud-stained yellow tow strap with heavy steel hooks on either end. "Stay here, Maya, do not unbuckle," he roared over the storm. He slammed the door shut and waded into the water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. The current immediately tore at his legs, trying to sweep his feet out from under him. He stumbled, going down to one knee, swallowing a mouthful of gritty, foul-tasting water. He coughed, spat, and dug his steel-toe boots into the submerged asphalt, fighting his way toward the Porsche. Inside the sinking car, Vivian saw a shape moving through the water. The yellow beam of the truck's headlights cast long, terrifying shadows. It was him. The man with the dirty nails. Tom Barrett. He didn't look like a hero. He looked soaked, miserable, and furious. His flannel shirt was plastered to his back, his hair matted against his skull. He slipped again, catching himself hard against the hood of the Porsche, his face twisting in pain as his hip collided with the metal. He banged a heavy fist against Vivian's window. "Open the window!" he yelled, his voice barely penetrating the glass. She shook her head frantically, pointing at the dead dashboard. The electricity was gone. The windows wouldn't roll down. Tom cursed. He looked at the water level. It was too high to open the door, and breaking the glass would let the rushing river right into her face. He had to pull the car out. Fast. He waded to the front of the Porsche, disappearing beneath the rushing water. Vivian watched her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The water inside her car was at her knees, now freezing her legs, ruining her suit, destroying her illusion of invulnerability. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering. Beneath the freezing water, Tom was blind. The muddy current stung his eyes. He ran his calloused hands along the smooth, aerodynamic underbelly of the Taycan, desperately searching for a tow hook, a structural crossmember, anything. His lungs burned. The current battered him. His fingers found a recess in the front bumper, the hidden tow eye slot. He fumbled in his pocket for his multi-tool, popping the plastic cover off. He jammed one of the heavy steel hooks into the loop, praying the threading held. He burst up from the water, gasping for air, hacking up river mud. He didn't look back at Vivian. He just grabbed the rest of the yellow strap and fought his way back to the truck. He hooked the other end to the heavy steel hitch receiver of the F250. He climbed back into the cab, shivering uncontrollably, water dripping from his nose onto the steering wheel. Maya was crying softly. "It's okay, Bug. Hold on tight." He panted his breath, fogging the cold windshield. He shifted into drive. He didn't hit the gas. He let off the brake slowly, letting the truck creep forward until the yellow tow strap pulled taut out of the water. The back of the truck dipped as it took the dead weight of the waterlogged Porsche. Tom pressed the accelerator. The V8 engine roared, a guttural, mechanical scream of burning diesel and raw torque. The massive tires spun, screeching against the wet asphalt, burning rubber that smelled acrid and sharp over the scent of the river. In the Porsche, Vivian felt a violent jolt. Her neck snapped back against the headrest. The car groaned, the chassis protesting as it was yanked against the terrible force of the current. For 3 agonized seconds, nothing happened. The truck spun its wheels. The Porsche remained wedged in the flow. The water in Vivian's lap sloshed violently. It's not going to work. She thought, a tear finally breaking free and mingling with the dirty water on her face. He's going to get dragged in with me. Then the truck's tires found purchase. The tread bit into the road. With a sickening lurch, the silver car was ripped forward. Vivian let out a sharp cry as the Taycan was dragged backward, fighting the water every inch. She felt every bump, every scrape of the undercarriage against debris. She watched the rusted tailgate of the F-25 owe through the rain-slicked glass. The exhaust pipe was spitting black smoke directly onto her windshield. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Slowly, agonizingly, the truck dragged the dead weight of the electric car out of the main channel and up the incline. When they finally cleared the water, reaching the high ground of the highway shoulder, Tom threw the truck into park. He didn't turn off the engine. He let it idle, shuddering and coughing triumphant. He leaned his forehead against the steering wheel, his chest heaving, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclench them from the wheel. His knuckles were raw and bleeding from slipping against the metal bumper. Behind him, the door of the Porsche clicked open manually. Vivian Hayes practically fell out onto the wet highway. She was soaked to the bone. Her charcoal suit was heavy with mud and slime. One of her expensive Italian leather boots was missing, lost in the floodwater inside her car. She hit her knees on the rough, wet asphalt, ignoring the sharp stones biting into her skin. She was shivering violently, coughing up the taste of copper and dirty water. She looked up at the 1994 Ford F250. It was rusted. It was ugly. It smelled terrible, and as the rain continued to fall, washing the mud from her face, Vivian Hayes didn't feel like a CEO. She felt entirely, painfully human. She stared at the man stepping out of the truck, his boots hitting the pavement, and for the first time in a decade, she didn't have a single sharp thing to say. Vivian's right knee throbbed where it had slammed against the steering column. The rain was washing the worst of the silt from her face, but it left behind a gritty film that ground against her teeth when she shivered. Tom Barrett stood over her. He didn't offer a hand right away. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling beneath the soaked flannel, his hands resting on his hips as if he were trying to physically hold his own exhaustion at bay. Water poured off the brim of his faded baseball cap. "You're bleeding," he said. His voice was flat. Not panicked, just stating a fact. Vivian looked down. A jagged scrape ran down her shin, the blood washing away in the rain as quickly as it welled up. She hadn't even felt it. She tried to push herself up off the asphalt, her bare foot slipping on the wet grease, slicking the road. Her muscles flooded with adrenaline, and sudden crushing cold simply refused to fire. She sagged back down, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping her blue lips. Tom swore softly. He closed the distance between them, leaning down. He didn't scoop her up like some cinematic hero. It was entirely practical. He gripped her under the arm, his large hand wrapping around her bicep, over the ruined fabric of her blazer. "On 3, he grunted. 1, 2, 3. He hauled her upward. Vivian stumbled her weight, leaning heavily against his side. He smelled of diesel exhaust, rainwater, and old sweat. It was an offensive combination that she would normally recoil from. Right now it smelled like gravity. It smelled like life. "My car," she chattered her teeth, clicking together so hard her jaw ached. She looked back at the silver Porsche. It was safe on the shoulder, but the interior was filled to the dashboard with muddy river water. The headlights were dead. The sleek machine looked pitiful. "Your car is totaled," Tom said, dragging her toward the passenger side of the idling truck. "You're not." He opened the heavy steel door of the F250. The hinges shrieked. "Climb in," he ordered. Vivian hesitated. The step up was high. Her wet clothes weighed 30 pounds, clinging to her skin like a second freezing layer of flesh. Tom didn't wait for her to figure it out. He put a hand on the small of her back and practically shoved her upward. She collapsed onto the bench seat. The vinyl was cracked, held together in places by strips of peeling grey duct tape. The seat springs groaned loudly under her weight. "Watch her foot," a small, high-pitched voice yelped. Vivian recoiled. Sitting less than 2 feet away, strapped into a faded plastic booster seat, was a little girl. She was clutching a ragged, stuffed rabbit. Her eyes were massive dark and entirely focused on Vivian's muddy, bare right foot, which had nearly grazed the child's knee. "Sorry," Vivian croaked, pulling her leg back, tucking her foot under the seat in a rare flash of profound embarrassment. Tom slammed the passenger door shut, sealing Vivian inside. The noise of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the violent rhythmic shaking of the V8 engine and the absolute roar of the heater. A second later, the driver's side door opened, and Tom heaved himself in. He brought a wave of cold air and wet smells with him. He slammed the door, shifted the transmission with a heavy clunk, and checked his mirrors. "Heater's on full," he muttered, not looking at her. He pulled the truck slowly onto the highway, putting distance between them and the rising floodwaters. The heat blew out of the vents in a heavy, suffocating stream. It smelled like burning dust, old dog hair, and melted plastic. To Vivian, it was pure agony. The hot air hit her freezing skin and triggered a violent wave of pins and needles that shot from her ankles to her collarbone. She squeezed her eyes shut, crossing her arms over her chest, shivering so hard her ribs ached. "Don't put your hands near the vent." Tom said, his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked road ahead. "You're too cold. It'll feel like it's burning you. Just let the ambient air warm you up." Vivian nodded stiffly, pulling her arms back. She opened her eyes. The interior of the truck was a mess. There were fast food wrappers crumpled on the floorboards, a half-empty bottle of motor oil rolling around behind the seat, and an overwhelming amount of dirt ground into the floor mats. It was a chaotic, disorganized environment. She hated it. She was entirely grateful for it. "Are you a mud monster?" Vivian blinked, turning her head slowly. The little girl Maya Tom had called her was leaning forward against her seatbelt harness. She was staring at Vivian's face. Vivian reached up her fingers, grazing her cheek. They came away coated in thick red clay. Her perfectly blown-out hair was plastered to her skull, dripping muddy water onto the collar of her $2,000 suit. "Maya, leave the lady alone," Tom said. His tone was exhausted. "She's had a bad day." "I have wipes," Maya offered. She dug a small, sticky hand into a plastic pocket hanging off the back of Tom's seat and pulled out a crumpled package of generic baby wipes. She held them out across the gap. Vivian stared at the cheap plastic packaging. An hour ago, if a child had handed her a damp wipe, she would have politely declined and found a restroom with artisanal soap. Now she reached out with a trembling hand and took them. "Thank you," Vivian said. Her voice sounded raw, entirely stripped of its usual boardroom polish. She pulled out a wipe. It smelled artificially like lavender and chemicals. She dragged it across her face. The mud came off in thick, ugly smears. "You lost your shoe," Maya observed quietly. "I did," Vivian said. She looked down at her bare foot, the skin pale and wrinkled from the freezing water, resting on the dirty rubber floor mat. "The river took it. The river took Daddy's fishing pole once," Maya said, nodding sagely. "He said a bad word." Tom sighed heavily, downshifting, as the truck began to climb a steeper grade. "All right, Bug, that's enough." The cab fell silent, save for the roar of the heater and the steady, annoying squeak of the windshield wipers. Vivian sat frozen, shivering, holding a dirty baby wipe, entirely at the mercy of a man she had mocked 30 minutes prior. The humiliation was acidic, burning the back of her throat, but underneath it was something sharper. Terror. The delayed realization that she had almost died in a silver cage. She looked over at Tom. He was gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The skin on the back of his hands was scraped raw. Bleeding. Because of her. The highway stretched out before them, an empty ribbon of black asphalt slick with rain. The storm was finally breaking the heavy sheets of water, tapering off into a steady, irritating drizzle. Inside the cab, the temperature was rising to an uncomfortable extreme, but Vivian didn't dare ask Tom to turn the heater down. Her clothes were beginning to steam, filling the tight space with the smell of wet wool and muddy river water. She patted down her pockets, her fingers numb and clumsy. She found her phone. She pulled it out. The screen was cracked and completely black. Water dripped from the charging port. "Dead." "Do you have a phone?" Vivian asked. It was the first full sentence she had spoken since getting in. The command in her voice was entirely habitual, slipping out before she could temper it. Tom didn't look at her. He reached into the center console, pushing aside a jumble of receipts and loose change, and pulled out a thick black smartphone encased in a heavy-duty rubber case. He tossed it into her lap. Vivian picked it up. No signal. "Towers are down," Tom said, reading her mind. "Storm knocked the grid out across the valley. Hasn't been a bar for 20 minutes. Vivian dropped the phone back onto the console. A creeping sense of isolation settled over her. She ran 3 companies. She had assistants, fixers, lawyers on retainer. She had people whose entire salaries were dedicated to ensuring she never found herself in a situation she couldn't control. And yet none of them were here. Her money was utterly useless in this rusted metal box. "Where are we going?" she asked, wrapping her arms tighter around her torso. "There's a truck stop about 5 miles up the interstate. High ground. They got a backup generator. We'll pull in there, see if the landlines are working. You can call whoever you need to call. I need to arrange a tow for the Porsche," she muttered, mostly to herself. "And a service team. The battery packs are compromised. If salt water got in—" "Lady," Tom interrupted. The word was sharp, tired. "Your car is a brick. Worry about getting dry before you worry about the warranty." Vivian's jaw tightened. The instinct to snap back, to put him in his place, flared hot and bright in her chest. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what my time is worth?" But she swallowed it. She tasted the river silt still clinging to the roof of her mouth, and the arrogance died before it reached her tongue. "You ruined your toe strap," she said instead, her voice quieter. Tom glanced in the rearview mirror. The heavy yellow strap was still attached to the hitch, trailing behind the truck on the wet highway, like a severed tail. He had been forced to cut it with his knife when the Porsche's tow hook jammed. "I'll buy another one," he said flatly. "I will reimburse you for it, and for your time." Tom let out a short, hollow exhale. It wasn't quite a laugh. It sounded a lot like the scoff she had given him back at the construction site. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I am not a charity case, Mr. Barrett." Vivian said, her back stiffening. She hated being indebted. Debt was a liability. "You performed a service. I will compensate you." Tom finally turned his head, taking his eyes off the road for 3 seconds to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, ringed with deep purple shadows of chronic exhaustion. He didn't look impressed by her offer. He looked annoyed. "I didn't pull you out for a paycheck, Ms. Hayes. I pulled you out because leaving someone to drown in a ditch is a shitty thing to do. Keep your money." Vivian flinched. The bluntness of his words stripped away the corporate veneer she hid behind. He wasn't negotiating. He was stating a moral baseline that she had just tried to put a price tag on. She turned her head, looking out the passenger window at the passing trees. The silence in the cab stretched out heavy and awkward. "Daddy," Maya's voice broke the tension. "Yeah, Bug, I'm hungry." Tom's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The irritation bled out of his posture, replaced by a quiet, heavy guilt. "I know, kiddo. We're almost to the diner. I'll get you some fries. Okay, okay," Maya said softly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled foil wrapper. She carefully peeled it open to reveal 2 squished, brightly colored fruit snacks. She leaned forward, extending her arm toward Vivian. "You can have the red one," Maya offered. "It's strawberry." Vivian stared at the sticky, lint-covered gummy resting in the child's palm. She hadn't eaten since a 6 a.m. espresso. Her stomach was a cold, hollow knot. Slowly she reached out and picked the gummy from Maya's hand. "Thank you, Maya," Vivian said softly. She put the candy in her mouth. It tasted like artificial sugar and pocket lint. It was the best thing she had eaten all day. Hank's 24-hour stop was a brutalist block of concrete and cinder block, sitting just off exit 42. The parking lot was deeply potholed, filled with massive semi-trucks, idling like sleeping beasts. Above the building, a large, buzzing neon sign flickered aggressively, casting a sickly red glow over the wet pavement. Tom parked the F250 near the entrance, slotting it between a muddy Jeep and a delivery van. He turned the key. The engine shuddered, violently, gave one last metallic cough, and died. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening. "Wait here," Tom said. He popped his door open, stepped out into the drizzle and walked around the front of the truck. He opened Vivian's door. She swung her legs out. Her ruined leather boot hit the pavement, followed by her bare foot. The ground was freezing, laced with sharp gravel and spilled diesel fuel. She winced, hobbling, as she tried to put weight on the cold concrete. Tom didn't offer his arm this time. He just reached into the back of the cab, pulled out a thick, faded grey wool blanket that smelled strongly of motor oil and campfire smoke, and threw it over Vivian's shivering shoulders. "Wrap up," he said, turning his attention to unbuckling Maya from her car seat. He lifted the girl out, setting her gently on the ground, holding her small hand. Vivian pulled the heavy blanket tight around her throat. It was scratchy rough against her skin, but the residual warmth from the truck cab was trapped in the fibers. She hobbled behind Tom and Maya as they walked toward the diner entrance. She felt the eyes of 2 truckers smoking by the door, tracking her, a woman in a shredded, mud-caked designer suit, wearing 1 boot and a mechanic's blanket. She kept her chin up, an automatic reflex, but she knew she looked pathetic. They pushed through the glass doors. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling aggressively of burnt, coffee-bleached floors and frying grease. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless insect-like hum. It was crowded. Stranded drivers filled the vinyl booths, waiting out the highway closures. "Hey, Tommy," a waitress in a pink uniform called out from behind the counter. She had a pot of coffee in one hand and a rag in the other. She took one look at the trio and stopped wiping the counter. Jesus, hun, you look like you went swimming in the quarry. Something like that. Brenda. Tom sighed, running a hand through his damp, matted hair. Got a booth in the back. For you always. Go sit. I'll bring a pot. Tom led them to a cracked red vinyl booth in the far corner, away from the windows. He slid Maya into the inside seat, sitting next to her. Vivian sat opposite them. The vinyl squeaked loudly as she shifted, trying to hide her bare foot beneath the table. Brenda appeared a moment later. She dropped a heavy ceramic mug in front of Tom and another in front of Vivian. The rims were chipped. She poured the coffee black, thick as crude oil. "Hot chocolate for the bug, coming right up," Brenda said, winking at Maya before looking at Vivian. Her eyes scanned the mud, the ruined suit, the expensive disheveled hair. "Need a towel, honey? Please." Vivian managed to say her voice tight. Brenda nodded and walked away. Vivian wrapped her cold, shaking hands around the ceramic mug. It burned her palms, but she didn't let go. She stared at the black liquid. The surface vibrated slightly with the heavy footsteps of the patrons walking past. "Drink it," Tom said. He was already halfway through his. "It'll raise your core temp." Vivian took a sip. It was awful. Bitter, acidic, and slightly scorched. She drank it anyway, feeling the heat track down her throat and settle in her hollow stomach. Tom pulled a menu from behind the napkin dispenser. He didn't look at the prices. "You want food?" "No," Vivian said immediately. Her stomach churned at the thought of heavy diner food. "I just need to use a phone." "Payphone is by the bathrooms," Tom said, gesturing with his chin toward the back hallway. "Takes quarters. I got some if you need 'em." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of change, sifting through pennies and dimes to find 3 quarters. He slid them across the scratched laminate table toward her. Vivian stared at the silver coins. 35 cents. She was worth $800 million on paper. She owned real estate in 3 countries. She wore a watch that cost more than the truck parked outside. And yet, sitting in this greasy diner, freezing, stripped of her armor, she was entirely dependent on a man counting spare change to make a phone call. The power dynamic had shifted so violently, so completely, that it left her dizzy. "Take it," Tom said softly. There was no mockery in his voice, just a tired kind of patience. Vivian reached out her fingers, brushing the cool laminate, and picked up the quarters. They felt heavy in her palm. "Thank you," she whispered. She slid out of the booth, clutching the wool blanket around her, and hobbled toward the back hallway. The payphone was old, encased in heavy metal. She picked up the receiver. There was a dial tone. She fed the quarters into the slot, the coins clanking loudly down the chute. She dialed the private number for her executive fixer, a man whose sole job was to make her problems disappear. It rang twice. "Yes, Ms. Hayes," a crisp, professional voice answered. "We saw the weather reports. Are you safe?" "I need a car," Vivian said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, hollow. "I'm at Hank's 24-hour stop on Interstate 8. Bring a blanket. And shoes. Flat ones." "Right away. What about the Porsche?" "It's in the river," Vivian said flatly. There was a brief pause on the line. "Understood. I will dispatch a recovery team immediately. Are you injured? Do you need medical personnel?" "No, just a car, fast." She hung up the heavy receiver. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal of the phone box, closing her eyes. She should feel relieved. The machine was in motion. Her world of efficiency and control was reasserting itself. Within an hour, she would be in the back of a climate-controlled SUV, drinking bottled water wrapped in cashmere. But as she opened her eyes and looked down the hallway past the fluorescent lights, she saw Tom Barrett. He was leaning his elbows on the table, resting his chin in his hands, watching his daughter drink a hot chocolate piled high with whipped cream. Maya was chattering away, pointing at something out the window. Tom smiled a small, tired, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He reached out and wiped a smudge of chocolate from the little girl's chin with his thumb. Vivian watched them. A strange, heavy ache settled in her chest, entirely separate from the cold. She had spent her entire life building walls, financial walls, corporate walls, social walls. She had insulated herself so thoroughly from the dirt and the grind of the world that she had forgotten what it actually looked like to just exist in it, to struggle, to survive. She walked back to the booth. Tom looked up as she approached. "Ride coming?" he asked. "Yes, about 40 minutes." She sat down. The vinyl squeaked again. She picked up her chipped mug and took another sip of the terrible coffee. "Mr. Barrett," Vivian started, her voice steadier now. She looked at him, really looked at him. At the dirt under his fingernails, the grease stain on his collar, the bruised knuckles. "Tom," he corrected quietly. "Tom," Vivian repeated. The name felt strange on her tongue, unprofessional, human. "Before, at the site, I was dismissive. I was rude about your truck. I apologize." Tom stared at her over the rim of his mug. The apology clearly surprised him. He set the cup down. "Forget it," he said. "You were stressed, site's behind schedule." "That is not an excuse for poor manners," Vivian said, strictly leaning forward slightly. "I insulted your vehicle, and then that same vehicle saved my life. I am not used to being wrong. It makes me uncomfortable. But I was wrong." Tom studied her face. The hardened CEO mask was entirely gone, washed away by the river, and stripped bare by the cold. In its place was just a woman, tired, bruised, and trying to find her footing. He gave a slow, measured nod. "It's a good truck," Tom said simply. "Ugly as sin, drinks gas like a sailor, but she pulls when you need her to." "She does," Vivian agreed. She looked at Maya, who was now using a spoon to scoop the last of the whipped cream from her cup. "And she got your daughter home." "Almost," Tom said. He glanced out the window at the parking lot where the rusted F250 sat under the neon lights, dripping mud onto the concrete. "Still gotta get her home. Soon as the highway patrol opens the eastbound lanes." Vivian looked at the truck too. She didn't see an antique anymore. She didn't see a safety hazard. She saw a lifeline forged in steel and duct tape. And for the first time in a decade, sitting in a greasy diner with a bare foot and a chipped mug, Vivian Hayes felt profoundly, undeniably small. 40 minutes later, the diner door swung open, letting in a sharp gust of wind and the low, throaty hum of a black Lincoln Navigator idling at the curb. A man in a sharply tailored navy trench coat stepped inside. Richard. He didn't look at the truckers, and he didn't blink at the harsh fluorescent lighting. His eyes scanned the room with predatory efficiency until they locked onto the back corner booth. He walked over his leather-soled shoes, silent against the sticky linoleum. "Ms. Hayes," Richard said softly, coming to a halt at the edge of the table. He carried a heavy canvas duffel bag in one hand. He glanced briefly at Tom and Maya, his expression registering absolutely nothing, before returning his attention to his boss. "The car is out front. The recovery team is at the riverbank, coordinating with local authorities. The Porsche is entirely submerged, but they have a line on it." "Thank you, Richard," Vivian said. Her voice was steady, but her throat felt tight. She slid out of the booth. The friction of the vinyl against her ruined wool trousers felt intensely uncomfortable. Richard immediately unzipped the duffel bag and produced a pair of thick, flat-soled leather loafers. He set them on the floor beneath her feet. Vivian looked down at them. They were sensible, clean, expensive. She slipped her cold, bare right foot into the shoe, wincing as the stiff leather rubbed against her raw skin. She took off the mechanic's blanket, the cold diner air instantly biting through her damp shirt. She folded the rough grey wool, carefully squaring the corners, and set it gently on the edge of the table. "I'll have a dry cleaning service return it," Vivian said to Tom. "Don't bother," Tom replied. He didn't stand up. He was wiping up a spill of hot chocolate with a cheap paper napkin. "It lives in the bed of the truck. It's supposed to be dirty." Vivian hesitated. She reached into her blazer pocket. Her fingers brushed against her soaked, useless leather wallet. She had black cards with limitless credit, but she had nothing to give him here in this physical space that held any weight. "Tom," Vivian said. The word felt heavy. He looked up. His eyes were deeply bloodshot, the bags beneath them purple and bruised in the harsh light. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't a corporate pleasantry. It was a raw, unpolished admission of debt. "Drive safe, Ms. Hayes," Tom said, tossing the soggy napkin onto his plate. He turned his attention back to Maya. "All right, Bug, let's go see if Brenda has any quarters for the claw machine." The dismissal was quiet, but absolute. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't want a moment. He just wanted to go back to being a father. Vivian turned and walked toward the exit, Richard trailing half a step behind her. She pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the bitter night air. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, damp chill. She climbed into the back of the Navigator. The interior was cavernous, smelling of rich leather and absolute sterilization. The heater was running, blowing a perfectly calibrated flow of warm, dry air. A cashmere blanket sat folded on the seat beside a bottle of electrolyte water. It was exactly what she had asked for. It was everything her money could buy. As the heavy door thudded shut, sealing her in a soundproof vacuum, Vivian looked out the tinted window. She could see the rusted front quarter panel of the 1994 Ford F25. Bathed in the red neon light of the diner sign. The SUV pulled away smoothly, accelerating down the on-ramp. Vivian pulled the cashmere blanket over her legs. It was incredibly soft. It didn't smell like motor oil, and it didn't scratch her skin. But as she sat in the perfect quiet of the luxury vehicle, she shivered. 4 days later, the floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a thick, choking layer of red clay across the valley. Vivian sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table on the 42nd floor of the Hayes Logistics building. The air in the room was cold, aggressively filtered, smelling faintly of glass cleaner and dry erase markers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but Vivian wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at a spreadsheet projected onto the wall. Her right knee still throbbed. Beneath the hem of her tailored navy slacks, a wide yellow bruise painted her shin. "The Eastern Ridge is a mess," Greg, the senior project manager, was saying. He clicked a laser pointer against the screen, highlighting a red column. "The topsoil washed out completely. We are looking at a 3-week delay on the foundation pour, which pushes our margins into the penalty zone." "What about the soil samples?" Vivian asked, her voice flat. "Ruined," Greg sighed, running a hand through his aggressively gelled hair. "That independent contractor Barrett didn't file the physical logs before the grid went down. We have to drill again. Frankly, Vivian, I think we should cut his contract. The guy operates out of a rusted pickup truck. It's embarrassing for the site, and he missed the deadline." The room fell silent. 5 other executives watched Vivian, waiting for her to nod. It was the standard protocol. If a gear in the machine slowed down, you replaced it with a newer, cheaper gear. Vivian looked down at her hands. The skin on her knuckles was perfectly smooth. She thought about the dark, freezing water creeping up her calves. She thought about the grinding scream of a V8 engine, the smell of burning rubber, and a pair of bleeding hands gripping a sticky steering wheel. Did he miss the deadline? Vivian asked quietly. Well, technically the site closed due to the weather, Greg said, shifting his weight. But he was supposed to have them to the trailer by 3. The river crested its banks at 2:45, Vivian stated. She looked up, her dark eyes pinning Greg to the spot. He didn't miss the deadline, Greg. The road washed away. Be that as it may, Greg countered, adopting a patronizingly gentle tone. We need reliability. We can bring in Vanguard Logistics. They have a fleet of new trucks, digital tracking the whole 9 yards. They're 30% more expensive, but they look the part. They look the part, Vivian repeated. She let the words hang in the freezing air of the boardroom. She stood up. The movement was a little stiff, but she didn't let the pain in her knee show on her face. She walked over to the glass window, looking down at the tiny, perfect cars crawling along the city streets far below. They all looked like toys. When the grid goes down, Vivian said, not turning around, when the cell towers fail and the digital tracking goes black, what does Vanguard Logistics do? I don't understand the question, Greg stammered. I do, Vivian said. She turned to face the room. Her expression was hard, entirely stripped of patience. They sit in their new trucks, and they wait for someone else to fix the problem. They wait for the water to recede. She walked back to the table and pressed a button on the console, turning the projector off. The spreadsheet vanished, plunging the front of the room into shadow. Tom Barrett didn't miss the deadline because he was lazy. Vivian said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the sharp, serrated edge that built her empire. He missed it because he was busy pulling my dead weight out of a ravine. I was in that flood, Greg. I watched $100,000 of German engineering turn into a coffin. You know what didn't fail a 30-year-old Ford and a man who doesn't know how to quit. The executive stared at her, stunned into absolute silence. We are not cutting his contract, Vivian commanded. She placed both hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward. In fact, you are going to rip up his current agreement. Draw up a new one. I want Barrett's company as the prime logistics contractor for the entire site development. Not just the samples. All of it. Vivian. Greg breathed, visibly pale. He doesn't have the fleet for that. He's a single operator. Then advance him the capital to buy the fleet, Vivian snapped. I don't care if he buys 10 rusted trucks just like the one he has. I want people on my site who understand friction. I want people who push when the math says they should drown. Get it done, Greg. Today. She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed her leather portfolio and walked out of the room, her sensible flat shoes making a sharp, authoritative sound against the hardwood floor. For the first time in years, her chest didn't feel tight. She felt like she could breathe. The valley smelled of wet dirt, rotting leaves, and evaporated diesel. The sun was beating down hard, baking the flooded riverbed into a cracked red crust. Tom Barrett stood over the open hood of his F250. His hands were coated in black grease up to the wrists, working a wrench around the alternator bracket. His knuckles were still wrapped in thin, fraying white bandages. A shadow fell over the engine block. Tom didn't look up immediately. He tightened the bolt with a sharp grunt, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his forearm, and finally turned his head. Vivian Hayes stood there. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore dark, heavy denim jeans, a simple black sweater, and a pair of thick-soled leather boots that already had a dusting of red clay on the toes. She had driven herself, pulling up in a boxy, unremarkable company SUV. No driver, no fixer. Tom grabbed a dirty rag from the fender and wiped his hands. He didn't smile. He just watched her. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice gravelly. "You're a long way from the penthouse." "Mr. Barrett," Vivian replied. She didn't sound defensive. She sounded grounded. She walked closer to the truck. She looked at the heavy steel bumper. It was severely scratched, the metal gouged where the tow hook had slipped. Vivian reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy bundle. She tossed it onto the hood of the truck. It landed with a solid thud. Tom looked at it. It was a brand-new industrial-grade recovery strap. It wasn't yellow. It was bright, obnoxious orange, rated for £30,000. "I owed you a strap," Vivian said. Tom picked it up. He felt the weight of the woven nylon tracing the heavy, drop-forged steel hooks with a grease-stained thumb. A small, dry smirk cracked the corner of his mouth. "This is overkill," he said. "I don't believe in minimum requirements anymore," Vivian countered. She reached into her jacket again and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She held it out to him. Tom didn't take it. His eyes narrowed slightly. "I told you I don't want a check." "It's not a check," Vivian said, her arm remaining perfectly still. "It's a contract, prime logistics for the Hayes site, grading, hauling, material delivery, the whole board." Tom stared at the envelope. He slowly wiped his hands on the rag again, stalling. "I've got one truck, Vivian, and it barely starts. The contract includes an immediate capital advance for fleet expansion," Vivian said, smoothly falling back into her corporate rhythm, but this time without the condescension. "You hire the drivers, you buy the trucks, you run the logistics. I need a site manager who doesn't run away when the water rises. I need you." Tom looked from the envelope to her face. He searched her eyes, looking for the pity, looking for the charity. He didn't find it. He found a cold, hard, calculating respect. She wasn't doing this to save him. She was doing it because she had recognized his worth. Slowly Tom reached out. His grease-stained fingers grasped the thick paper. He pulled it from her hand. "I need a guarantee," Tom said, his voice low. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "You're negotiating with me right now?" "Yeah, I am." Tom stepped closer, the smell of hot oil and stale sweat washing over her. She didn't flinch. "I pick my own hours. Maya gets picked up from school at 3 every day, no exceptions. If a delivery runs late because I'm with my kid, the delivery runs late. You don't like it, you can take this back to the 42nd floor." Vivian looked at him. She looked at the sheer, unyielding stubbornness in his jaw. She thought about the little girl in the back seat, offering her a lint-covered gummy bear in the middle of a disaster. A genuine, entirely unpracticed smile broke across Vivian's face. It felt strange on her muscles, but it felt right. "Agreed," Vivian said. She held out her hand. Tom looked at her clean, uncalloused hand. He looked at his own, covered in black sludge. He hesitated. "Shake it, Tom," she said softly. "A little dirt won't kill me." He reached out and gripped her hand. His palm was rough like sandpaper, but his grip was solid, warm. As they let go, the 1994 Ford F-25 suddenly hissed a tiny puff of steam escaping from the radiator cap. Vivian looked at the truck, then back to Tom. "Does she actually run, or is it mostly just noise?" Tom laughed, a real deep laugh that echoed across the dry riverbed. "Mostly noise. But she gets the job done. Most days," Vivian murmured, echoing his words from a lifetime ago. "Yeah," Tom said, tossing the heavy orange tow strap into the cab. "Most days." Vivian turned and walked back toward her SUV. Her boots crunched loudly against the gravel. She didn't look back as she got in, but as she drove away, rolling the window down to let the hot, dusty air into the cabin, she realized something profound. For a billionaire who had spent her entire life chasing perfection, she finally understood the absolute, undeniable value of rust. The storm eventually broke, but the impact of that day washed away years of Vivian's hardened cynicism, proving that real value isn't measured in polished chrome, but in the gritty, imperfect willingness to show up when everything else fails. If this story of raw humanity and unexpected survival struck a chord with you, please hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that everyday heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they drive rusty trucks. Don't forget to subscribe for more deeply grounded stories that remind us of what truly matters.